Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into one of the most terrifying, deeply unsettling historical nightmares California has ever seen. We're talking about the Golden State Killer. But this isn't just a story about a dark, decades-long mystery. It's actually a masterclass in human ingenuity. It's about a relentless pursuit of justice and how one absolute game-changer of a scientific breakthrough fundamentally rewrote the rulebook on how we solve cold cases. Now, to really wrap your head around how wild this case is, you have to understand this massive paradox. For 40 years, police actually had the killer's DNA. Literally. They had pristine biological evidence carefully preserved from multiple crime scenes across decades. The ultimate biological fingerprint just sitting right there in an evidence locker. Which naturally brings us to the core mystery of our explainer today. If they had his exact genetic code in their hands, why on earth couldn't they find him? For decades, that exact question completely haunted the victims, the investigators, and really the entire public.
Section 1, a nightmare in California. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's look at the sheer terrifying scale of what this man inflicted on California during the 70s and 80s. This wasn't some localized random string of crimes. It was a sprawling, incredibly methodical campaign of violence. 161. That is the staggering number of crimes this single offender eventually admitted to. 161 crimes that permanently altered the lives of 48 different victims. Let's break down what that actual toll looks like. Before we even knew him as the Golden State Killer, this elusive guy operated under a few different names. In Northern California, he was the East Area Rapist, and later down in Southern California, the original Night Stalker. We're talking 45 rapes, 12 homicides, and over 120 residential burglaries. And honestly, what made him so incredibly terrifying was how he did it. He studied neighborhoods. He watched houses. He literally learned the specific day-to-day routines of his victims before striking in the dead of night. It got to the point where entire communities completely changed how they lived, buying security systems and getting dogs, all because they were terrified he was out there watching them in the dark. When you trace the timeline, you really see how this nightmare escalated. The attacks kick off in Northern California in 1976. By 1980, the violence takes a drastic turn, culminating in brutal murders down in Southern California, like the incredibly tragic killings of Lyman and Charlene Smith. But then, in 1986, the crimes just stop. Completely mysteriously, he basically vanishes into thin air. And it wasn't until April of 2018 that a man named Joseph DeAngelo was finally arrested, eventually pleading guilty in 2020. Just think about that agonizing gap between 1986 and 2018. Over 30 years of total, absolute silence.
Section 2, the DNA dead end.
See, the killer was meticulous. He left absolutely no fingerprints, no obvious weapons behind. Nobody ever clearly identified a vehicle. But like we mentioned, he did leave DNA. So going back to our big question, why couldn't they catch him if they had the DNA? Well, it's actually pretty simple. The genetic profile didn't have a name attached to it. Throughout the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, police used that DNA to prove beyond a doubt that the crimes in Northern and Southern California were all connected to the exact same guy. But whenever they ran that profile through traditional criminal databases, nothing. Crickets. He'd never been arrested for a felony that required a DNA swab, so as far as the system was concerned, he was just a ghost in the machine.
Section 3, the genealogy breakthrough.
But right here is where our story pivots from just crushing frustration to one of the most brilliant investigative discoveries in modern history. Enter investigator Paul Holes. After decades of traditional police work literally hitting a brick wall, Holes decides to flip the script. He asks this remarkably simple but completely profound question. What if his DNA belongs to someone related to him? This right here, this is the ultimate aha moment of our explainer. A massive paradigm shift. Holes realized they didn't actually need the killer's DNA to be in a database. They just needed his family's. The key was a fundamental shift in the technology they were using. See, a traditional police database only looks for direct, one-to-one matches of known offenders, right? If you aren't already in the system, you're invisible. But a public genealogy database, the kind everyday people use to trace their ancestry, that searches for distant family connections and genetic relatives. So by taking the killer's crime scene DNA and uploading it to an open-source genealogy site, investigators completely sidestepped that traditional law enforcement dead end. It was genius.
Section 4, building the family tree.
Once they actually got a hit for distant cousins who shared fragments of the killer's DNA, the real painstaking work began. And here is exactly how they pulled it off. First, run the DNA in a public database. Second, find those distant genetic relatives. Third, trace those relationships backward through time to find common ancestors. We're talking like great-great-grandparents from the 1800s. And finally, step 4, build those family trees forward again. They looked at ages, locations, family histories, slowly narrowing down this massive suspect pool until they landed on a single living name that perfectly fit the profile of the killer. I mean, it was genetic detective work on a completely unprecedented scale.
Section 5. Catching the killer. So, as investigators meticulously mapped out these sprawling family trees, cross-referencing old census records and birth certificates with genetic markers, the net finally tightened around one man, Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old guy living a seemingly perfectly ordinary life in the Sacramento area. But honestly, the most shocking detail of all, he was a former police officer. No way, right? The very man who had been terrorizing these communities and perfectly evading capture for decades actually had insider knowledge of law enforcement tactics. Now, as strong as a genealogy lead on a family tree is, it's not enough to just walk up and make an arrest. Investigators needed absolute bulletproof certainty. So they quietly put DeAngelo under surveillance. They secretly obtained a new DNA sample associated with him, just, discarded items from his daily life. And when they finally compared that fresh sample to the decades-old crime scene evidence, it was a direct, perfect match. The 40-year hunt was officially over. On April 24, 2018, they made the arrest. Section 6. Justice and future questions.
While the arrest and his 2020 guilty plea finally closed a 40-year cold case, we really need to take a second to reflect on what this truly means for the victims. A courtroom verdict, no matter how historic, couldn't erase decades of fear. It couldn't bring murdered loved ones back. There's no neat, simple, happy ending here. The victims' lives and the lives of their families were permanently altered by what DeAngelo did. But what they did get, finally, after all those years, was answers. The monster had a name, and he was held accountable. So the really crucial takeaway here is this. The Golden State Killer case is this absolute landmark example of modern forensic science. It proved, definitively, that evidence collected decades ago still matters. The absolute smallest, microscopic trace of DNA left behind a crime scene can actually survive longer than the criminal who left it. It can reach right back through time to finally ensure justice is served.
But of course, this incredible breakthrough also leaves us with a massive ethical dilemma. Which brings us to our final question for you today. How much of our genetic information should be available to investigators? If a distant cousin taking a fun online DNA test can unknowingly lead police right to your front door, where exactly do we draw the line between solving horrific cold cases and protecting our modern genetic privacy? It's a hugely complex debate, and it's one that is still raging today. I hope this explainer helped you understand exactly how the Golden State Killer was caught and the wild science that made it happen. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.